Tonight we begin with a warning that US national security officials had anticipated, that British intelligence had tracked for weeks, and that NATO commanders had quietly prepared contingencies for. A nuclear threat that unfolded not over diplomatic channels, but in a single televised address. A single address that forced the Pentagon into emergency mode. A single address that triggered classified briefings in the Situation Room. A single address that reminded every world leader watching that Vladimir Putin still has his finger on the most dangerous button in human history. What Putin did today crossed a threshold that Western leaders had desperately hoped would hold through the winter. And when that threshold broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with defiance, with precision, and with a military strike so perfectly timed that it served as a direct answer to Moscow's nuclear bluster. For several months now, there had been whispers, not official assessments, not formal intelligence reports, just whispers, that Putin was preparing something far more provocative than his usual rhetoric. Putin has been threatening, yes, but he has been methodical in his threatening. His warnings have followed a certain cadence, a pattern, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and London this week was that the choreography went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Kremlin communications know the indicators. The repositioning of nuclear-capable assets, the increased activity at strategic submarine bases, the unusual movements of mobile missile launchers, the sudden restriction of information from Russian military channels. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. Western intelligence services have learned this lesson repeatedly over the past 3 years of war. The pattern is unmistakable. Silence precedes escalation. Quiet precedes provocation. And the longer the silence, the more significant the statement that breaks it. This time, the silence lasted 11 days. 11 days of reduced public appearances. 11 days of minimal state media coverage of the war. 11 days that ended this morning with a statement that sent shockwaves through every capital in the Western Alliance. Early this morning, Western intelligence agencies detected what they described as a fundamental shift in Russian nuclear signaling, including explicit references to American and British targets that had not been articulated publicly since the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are the kinds of statements that Putin only issues when he is signaling something very specific. Imminent military action, a test of Western cohesion, or a desperate attempt to freeze the battlefield before his forces lose more ground. Intelligence analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his nuclear posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without diplomatic warning, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency in the free world stops what it's doing and pays attention. Putin's statement, delivered from the Kremlin in a carefully staged address, left nothing to interpretation. He spoke directly about American military installations. He spoke directly about British support for Ukrainian long-range strikes. He spoke about the legitimate targets that Russia would consider if Western weapons continued to strike Russian territory. Those who believe they are safe behind ocean borders, Putin said, staring directly into the camera, should reconsider their geography. That single sentence activated emergency protocols across NATO. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, secure communications lines between Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw were burning with activity. The message was clear. Putin had just named the United States and United Kingdom as potential nuclear targets. And he had done so on live television for the entire world to see. The response issued by Western governments tonight was not normal. It was not routine diplomatic condemnation. It was not a symbolic statement of concern. It was an urgent, coordinated message of deterrence. Officials speaking after emergency National Security Council meetings described Putin's statement as reckless, unprecedented in its specificity, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of a leader who has exhausted conventional options. But nuclear intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most dramatic acts of defiance we have witnessed in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of Putin's nuclear threat being broadcast, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated strike deep inside Russian-occupied territory. These weren't the routine harassment operations we've seen throughout the war. These were precision strikes using advanced Western-supplied systems, weapons that Ukraine only deploys when they are sending an unmistakable strategic message. The timing was deliberate. The targets were carefully selected, and the message was impossible to misunderstand. Ukraine will not be intimidated by nuclear threats. Multiple sources within Ukrainian military command, speaking on background, confirmed that the operation was planned to coincide with any major Russian escalation. "We have contingencies for everything Moscow does," one source said, including this. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on Russian military command infrastructure, including a regional headquarters in occupied territory that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned winter offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could attack. They hit command bunkers. They hit ammunition storage facilities. They hit logistical nodes that were preparing to supply the next wave of Russian operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the brain and the arteries of Russia's regional military apparatus. The infrastructure that would have made Putin's next escalation operational. This is what made Western officials' warnings so urgent tonight. Putin's nuclear threat wasn't just rhetoric, it was designed to create space for conventional military action. It represented the kind of psychological operation that could paralyze Western decision-making if left unanswered. And Ukraine, understanding that calculus completely, responded with overwhelming force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with surgical precision. They didn't strike civilian areas. They didn't target population centers. They hit military command facilities with strikes so accurate that secondary explosions continued for hours. They hit weapons depots that Russian forces had been filling for weeks. The destruction was comprehensive, but more importantly, it was symbolic. It said, "Your threats do not scare us, your nuclear warnings do not paralyze us, we will continue to fight." Ukrainian President Zelensky's office released a statement that was remarkable in its brevity. "Russia threatens, Ukraine acts." 3 words that captured everything. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Putin's nuclear warning was designed to fracture the resolve of Western governments after months of political uncertainty about continued support for Ukraine. Putin wanted to see whether the United States would blink, whether Britain would reconsider its weapons shipments, whether the European consensus would crack under the weight of nuclear fear. But instead, the opposite happened. The West didn't fracture. They issued a coordinated response that was so unified, so rapid, that even Kremlin observers noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, the Western alliance did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under condition of anonymity described Putin's nuclear statement as coercive escalation, an attempt to change the psychological landscape of the conflict without actually changing military reality. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and undeterred. Their strikes were not only militarily devastating, they were timed so precisely that they served as a direct rebuttal to Putin's morning address. That timing matters because it shows something crucial about Ukraine's command structure. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian moves. They are anticipating them. They are prepared for them. And they are capable of responding instantly. This is the posture of a military that has internalized the lessons of 3 years of existential warfare. This is what tactical maturity looks like. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's defiant response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out strikes on at least 6 separate military targets, forcing Russian commanders to evacuate forward positions across 2 oblasts. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces targeted communication relays that had been upgraded in the last month with advanced Russian encryption equipment. Ukrainian drone units operating behind enemy lines reportedly destroyed fuel depots used by Russian forces to supply armored operations. This wasn't just a counterstrike. This wasn't just a message. This was battlefield dominance demonstrated in real time. This was strategic initiative seized at the exact moment when Russia expected paralysis. And strategic initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed march on Kiev. For every nuclear threat Putin has issued, Ukraine has answered with military action. For every escalation in rhetoric, Ukraine has countered with escalation on the battlefield. For every attempt at psychological warfare, Ukraine has responded with kinetic warfare. The pattern is unmistakable, and it is a pattern that Moscow has been unable to break. Remember, Putin thought his nuclear arsenal would prevent Western intervention entirely. He thought the threat of atomic weapons would keep American and British weapons out of Ukrainian hands. He thought Europe would splinter under energy pressure before the first winter was over. He thought nuclear rhetoric would accomplish what his conventional military could not. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking harder than ever before. Western weapons are flowing in unprecedented quantities. NATO's eastern flank is more fortified than at any point since the Cold War. And Putin's nuclear threats are being answered not with capitulation, but with cruise missiles hitting Russian military targets. This is not the outcome Moscow planned. This is not the outcome Moscow expected. And based on the intelligence we're seeing tonight, it is not an outcome Moscow knows how to reverse. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Putin's nuclear warning happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want total mobilization and escalation. Russian oligarchs want the war to end before more of their assets are frozen. Russian mothers want their sons to stop coming home in body bags. Russian propagandists want victories to broadcast instead of explaining away defeats. Putin is balancing these competing demands while fighting a war that has gone catastrophically wrong from day one. And when leaders in that position make nuclear threats, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from desperation. They're doing it from isolation. They're doing it because the conventional options have been exhausted. Tonight's nuclear warning should be understood in that context. This is not a confident leader signaling from a position of dominance. This is a cornered leader reaching for the most dangerous card in his hand because all the others have failed. And that makes him both more dangerous and more predictable. More dangerous because desperate leaders take irrational risks. More predictable because those risks follow patterns that intelligence services can anticipate. The White House's formal response, now distributed through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States will not be intimidated by nuclear blackmail. Officials said plainly that Putin's statement was inconsistent with the behavior expected of a responsible nuclear power. That is diplomatic language for, we see exactly what you're doing and it won't work. You don't usually hear that level of directness from the National Security Council unless something genuinely serious is at stake. British officials were equally forceful. The Prime Minister's office released a statement calling Putin's threats a sign of strategic failure, not strength, while reaffirming that British support for Ukraine would continue without pause. Behind closed doors, we're told that emergency consultations are ongoing between the nuclear powers of NATO. The United States, Britain, and France are coordinating their messaging carefully. They want Putin to understand that nuclear threats will not fracture the alliance. They want him to understand that escalation will be met with escalation. And they want him to understand that the world is watching. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed the nation in a resolute, unshakable speech tonight. He said, "We have heard nuclear threats before, we will hear them again, they do not change our mission." He said, "Every threat from Moscow is a confession of weakness. Strong nations do not need to threaten the destruction of the world." And he said, "Ukraine stands today as we have stood every day of this war, unbowed, unbroken, and unafraid." These are not mere words. These are statements from a wartime president who has survived assassination attempts, withstood the bombardment of his capital, and watched his nation endure horrors not seen in Europe since World War II. When Zelenskyy speaks of defiance, he speaks from experience. And tonight, that defiance was backed by missile strikes that lit up the Russian rear. Here's what makes the situation even more alarming. Putin's nuclear warning wasn't delivered in isolation. Along with his direct threat to American and British targets, Russian strategic forces conducted unscheduled exercises with nuclear-capable bombers. Russian submarines altered their patrol patterns in the North Atlantic. Russian state media launched a coordinated campaign warning of catastrophic consequences for Western capitals. All of this happened within the same 48-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means a coordinated campaign is underway. Intelligence officials are now working to determine whether these moves represent genuine preparation or sophisticated theater. But in the world of nuclear strategy, the distinction matters less than it might seem. Theater can become reality in minutes, and the margin for miscalculation is razor-thin. This is what makes the current moment so precarious. Not because Putin will necessarily use nuclear weapons, but because the environment he is creating makes accidents and misunderstandings more likely. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Putin is preparing a major conventional escalation and using nuclear threats to deter Western intervention. Another is that Putin is attempting to create domestic justification for further mobilization by portraying Russia as under existential threat. A third possibility, the one generating the most concern in Washington and London, is that Putin is genuinely signaling willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons if the battlefield situation deteriorates further. But today, Ukraine took that calculation and complicated it dramatically. They didn't hesitate. They didn't consult with Western capitals before acting. They didn't give Moscow time to shape the narrative. They struck. And in doing so, they demonstrated that nuclear threats will not freeze the battlefield. If anything, they will accelerate Ukrainian operations. What we're watching now is a test of nuclear credibility. Putin wants to see whether his nuclear arsenal can accomplish what his conventional forces cannot. Ukraine wants to demonstrate that nuclear intimidation will never work against a nation fighting for survival. The United States wants to deter Russian nuclear use while supporting Ukrainian military success. And Europe wants to prevent catastrophic escalation while refusing to abandon a fellow European democracy. These objectives are not always compatible. The tensions between deterrence and support, between caution and commitment, are real. But tonight they appear aligned in ways that Putin clearly did not expect. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are monitoring Russian command networks for signs of how Moscow will respond to Ukraine's defiant strikes. They say confusion is evident in Russian communications. They say Putin's military commanders were not expecting such an immediate Ukrainian response. And they say the decision to issue explicit nuclear threats against the US and UK is almost certainly part of a broader psychological operation intended to create fear and hesitation in Western capitals. But Ukraine is not hesitating. In fact, Ukraine is pressing harder. Their response today, immediate, devastating, and perfectly targeted, sent a message to Moscow that nuclear rhetoric will be answered with military action. And it sent a message to Western capitals that their weapons are being used effectively. More importantly, it sent a message to the Russian people. A message that says, your leaders promised you a short victorious war, what you have instead is a long bloody stalemate, and no amount of nuclear threatening will change that. That message may be the most significant of all. As the night continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with his nuclear warning. But what we already know is that Ukraine's response was immediate and effective. It demonstrated military capability that Russia cannot match. It reinforced Western confidence that their support is making a difference. And it showed Putin that nuclear threats will not intimidate a nation that has already survived his worst conventional attacks. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the coming days. If Russia escalates further, this moment will be remembered as the point where nuclear rhetoric became genuinely dangerous. If Russia recalibrates, Ukraine and the West have already proven they are prepared for whatever comes next. They have shown they are not paralyzed by fear. They have shown they are ready to fight. And tonight, for the first time since the war began, Putin appears genuinely uncertain about his next move. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet after issuing nuclear threats, it means he is recalculating. It means he is choosing his next move very carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he should have understood 3 years ago. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon them. And nuclear threats, no matter how terrifying, cannot change those fundamental facts. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Putin's nuclear warning did not fracture the alliance. Ukraine's response demonstrated strength, not fear. And the world witnessed a nation refuse to bow to atomic blackmail. And we will be here, watching every development, analyzing every signal, as this dangerous chapter continues to unfold.